starting off, I, as a Christian, reject this dilemma outright because it is assuming a worldview that is inconsistent with the Christian worldview and understanding of God. It's an attempt to do an internal critique of the Christian worldview, but it fails to represent it correctly. Welcome back to another episode of Campfire Apologetics, where I help equip the everyday Christian with tools to help defend their faith in an increasingly hostile culture. I'm Mark Hudson, and I wanted to address something that, at least for me, comes up pretty often. I don't know about you. You can tell me in the comments there once we get into it if this is something that you encounter or experience, but it is the issue of the Euthyphro dilemma. And, I'll get into what that is for those of you who may have not heard of that or aren't familiar with it. But I think it's important. It's a point that's brought up quite a bit. But in order to have a conversation about anything really, or to be able to answer objections or questions, we have to use logic and reason, and it's inescapable. You use logic and reason pretty much every second of every day. As you hear me say these things, your brain is processing them through your logical faculties, and it's important to address this because in logic we find the ability to think properly and recognize what are known as fallacies. And, not only that, but I get into this a little more in another episode, but, thinking clearly and thinking reasonably and logically is thinking like God, because God is a logical and reasonable God, and he has made us in his image, and we are to think like him or do our best to do so in our finite understanding of that. Now, if you've never heard the word fallacies, which is kind of, we're not going to get into a ton of those. I'll talk about a few of them to kind of paint the picture. But what it means is basically it's a mistake in reasoning. It's kind of like a logical flaw in their thought process. So many times a critic will be guilty of reasoning wrongly when posing an objection. Now, it's not only for critics. I mean, everybody does it. Christians do it too. I'm just speaking in this context, and but it does take practice, I think, to recognize these things. I'm still working on it myself. There's times when someone says something to me, and I know it seems off. Something just isn't right about it, but sometimes in the moment I can't really figure out what it is that is wrong. And but that is, I think, a good place to start, is that you see that you're starting to think that way, you're starting to reason that way. Like, you hear something and you think, okay, something's really weird about that, something's off about it, I'm really not sure exactly what it is. But the more you expose yourself to it, the more you think about these things, I think the easier it gets. And that's how we work through these things. That's how we work through these hard questions. So again, I plan on doing another episode, a little more in-depth look, where we look at informal fallacies a little deeper. And in that one, I'll give a lot more examples. But here I'll give you a few. And this is just so you have a better understanding or a better idea as, to what it is that I'm talking about. And also because, the issue I'm dealing with in this video commits a fallacy, and having a better framework will help you make sense of that, that framework, or that the understanding of what that fallacy is when I get into it. And that is, again, the Euthyphro dilemma. So some examples of some common informal fallacies are arguments from silence, the subset fallacy, and the bifurcation fallacy. Now, don't worry, I will get into those things and I will talk about what they are. A lot of fallacies anyway, sound scarier than what they really are, because they use some larger words, some things that are sometimes hard to say. There's so many more than that, but I will stick to just these for now to give us a framework, and also to make sure that this episode doesn't go on for an eternity, because that could easily take a much longer time than I'm going to take here. But there's some I think that are even maybe more common than these. But I see these mainly when it comes to dealing with, like the Bible, and more specifically, particular passages of Scripture. Now, an argument from silence is a false assumption that if something is not mentioned or stated, that it did not happen. Now, many times in the Bible, there are details in one gospel that another might omit, and people will claim that that's a contradiction. But different authors will include whatever it is that they personally want to include, and they might omit other information. And it doesn't mean that if one author omits a particular detail that it didn't happen. Or, for instance, if I wrote an autobiography about my life and I never mention that I used the bathroom many times throughout my life, if I never mention that fact, that doesn't somehow mean that I've never used the bathroom. Another one you might see when dealing with objections, maybe more in particular the Bible and Christian belief, is the subset fallacy. Now, this occurs when someone claims that A and B are contradictory, when in actuality, A is a subset of B, or B is a subset of A, which would mean that they are consistent with one another and not contradictory. So, for example, because I know when you start just saying letters, things can get kind of confusing. You're like, all of a sudden I'm talking about the alphabet. But for example, if I wrote a document of some kind, and I wrote down my experience at, let's say, a concert, and I said that there were 1,000 people there, then a friend of mine who was at the same concert wrote down their thoughts, and they wrote that there were 20,000 people there. Now, if you have 20,000 people there, then you also have 1,000 people there. So maybe my focus was on a particular 1,000 people for whatever specific point I was making when I wrote it. Or if I say that you have 5 fingers, someone might say, no, you have 10 fingers, but 5 is a subset of 10. So therefore, saying that you have 5 fingers is not contradictory to you also having 10 fingers. If you have 10, then you also have 5. So again, there's many, many more fallacies that we could talk about, and I will at another time. But the last one that I want to mention is the bifurcation fallacy. And this fallacy is what the Euthyphro dilemma commits. So I'm going to explain, or I'm not going to explain, sorry, like what it is quite yet. I'm going to get into the dilemma first, and then we could talk a little more about the particular fallacy, because maybe if I tell you what the dilemma is, you might be able to pick up on what the fallacy is. But if not, then we'll get into it and I'll explain it. But so what is Euthyphro's dilemma, and is it actually a dilemma? So Euthyphro's dilemma is a philosophical dilemma posed by many atheists that challenges the nature of morality. The dilemma comes from the writings of Plato, and they come from what's known as Plato's dialogues. There were a few volumes of these dialogues, and in them, Socrates questions Euthyphro, who claims to be an expert on piety and religion, which essentially on the nature of goodness. He's claiming to be an expert on those things. And many use this dilemma to address or challenge the nature of morality. So the dilemma goes like this: is something good or moral because God wills it, Or does God will it because it is good or moral? Now, this question stumped Euthyphro, hence the name Euthyphro's dilemma. Is something good because God says, or does God recognize something good from a source outside of himself? Is morality arbitrary, or is it independent of God? So, starting off, I, as a Christian, reject this dilemma outright because it is assuming a worldview that is inconsistent with the Christian worldview and understanding of God. It's an attempt to do an internal critique of the Christian worldview, but it fails to represent it correctly. If an atheist or a non-believer asks me, a Christian, about God, then I'm going to give them an answer from my Christian worldview. Just as if I ask them a question, they're going to respond from their worldview. This only makes sense. So if someone is asking me about my God, then I'm going to give an answer that is consistent with my God. For the Christian, the Euthyphro dilemma assumes a false starting point and commits the bifurcation fallacy. It's also known as the false dilemma fallacy, the either or fallacy, or I've even heard people say false dichotomy. So either way you spin it, they are all saying the same thing. You know, the either or bifurcation, false false dichotomy, you know, whatever you want to call it. They're all saying the same thing. Now, this is when an objection is presented that only gives a this or that solution, when in reality there is another option or solution to an objection or a dilemma. For example, was last night the first time you beat your wife with a bat, or have you beat her with a bat before? I stole that from Robbie Lashua. I was at a Stand to Reason Apologetics conference, and he was doing a little breakout session, and I sat in the front row, and he decided to pick on me and use that. So, and then I told him at the end of that last night was actually the first time that I beat my wife with a bat. Obviously kidding. So anyway, yeah, like let's go back to that, right? Was last night the first time you beat your wife with a bat, or have you beat your wife with a bat before? So this challenge anyway, it assumes that morality and God are separate from one another. Either morality exists on its own outside of God, which is known as moral realism, or God arbitrarily decides what is good or moral, which is known as divine command theory. God has decreed that murder, theft, adultery is wrong. If God arbitrarily decided what was moral or good, then he could easily just change his mind at a later date and say that these things are now good and right. So going back to that example, the either or is, you can see that it's a fallacy because, was last night the first time you beat your wife with a bat, or have you beat her before? Well, it's a false either or because I've never done either one of those things. So there's a third option. And that's what bifurcation fallacy is there is a third option. It only presents two as if those are the only two options, but there is a third option. So yeah, God is unchanging, and that says that in Malachi 3:6. It states, "For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, you, O children of Israel, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." God is the necessary precondition for morality because he himself is the very source of goodness. He doesn't arbitrarily decide what is good, and he doesn't appeal to a standard outside of himself to discover what is good. You cannot separate good from God's nature. God's goodness is self-existent and unchanging. If goodness exists, then God exists. And if God exists, goodness exists. You can't have one without the other. Goodness is not something that God chooses or discovers. Goodness is what God is, and he wills what is good because he is good. His very being is good. Therefore, morality is not based on arbitrary decisions God makes, nor external things that God is constrained by. Morality is God's expression of his holy and perfect character. Psalm 119:68 says, "You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes." 1 John 1:5 says, "This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." Matthew 5:48, "You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." The dilemma suggests that morality can be argued or debated independently of God, but morality itself is impossible to justify apart from the Christian worldview. Without God, there is no absolute or ultimate objective standard for morality. Good and evil then become subjective human constructs, which means there's no rational basis whatsoever for objective moral duties. For instance, torturing babies for fun. I've used that before, but it drives the point home. Um, you could never say that that would be objectively wrong. It would simply be an opinion if someone chose to say that they did not like it. Greg Kokel writes in an article addressing the Euthyphro dilemma, quote, "Relativists who make any claim to knowledge have no basis for their assertion. They are standing not on solid ground, but on thin air." And this is why Greg and Frank Beckwith chose the title Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair, for a book they co-authored on the topic of relativism. It paints a good word picture and illustration. Side note, I highly recommend picking that book up. I just got done reading it not too long ago, and it was really good. I learned a lot from it. Might be one of those, one of the books that I go back to. Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Without a fountain of knowledge, morality, laws of logic, etc., everything is arbitrary and relative," which is the problem with the Euthyphro dilemma. Christianity is the only worldview that can give a coherent or meaningful answer to this challenge. The dilemma collapses, under the Christian worldview. Goodness is an extension and reflection of the very nature of God. It can't be separated from him. God's commands reflect his nature, which is good. Therefore, his commands are necessarily good. Only in Christianity can morality be absolute, objective, and meaningful. All of humanity recognizes what is moral and good. We yearn for justice and what is right. This is because we are made in the very image of God, as Genesis 1:27 states. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Moral truths are written on our hearts. It's part of the natural law written into our being from creation, being made in God's image. Romans 2:15. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Jesus is the perfect embodiment and image of God. He is God. Therefore, his very nature is perfect and good. His nature is morally perfect. John 14:9. Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen my Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" Hebrews 1:3 says, "He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power." After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Jesus was perfect in every way, the perfect representation of the nature and goodness of God. He was not arbitrary, and he did not look to anything outside of himself to understand goodness. He could not do that which was not good because his nature does not allow it. So is the Euthyphro dilemma really a dilemma? As we have seen, it is built on a false premise that at its foundation is fallacious. It assumes that God is either arbitrary or that God appeals to a moral standard outside of himself. But goodness itself is part of God's very nature, and it cannot be separated. He is the standard of goodness. God is the necessary precondition for goodness and morality, and without him, neither exist. This is why the Christian worldview is the only worldview that provides a solid foundation for objective morality or goodness. Without God, goodness and morality collapse into subjectivity, leaving no real basis for distinguishing between right and wrong. Because God exists, goodness exists. Objective moral values and duties exist and are meaningful. So, yeah, The main point is that God's very character is good. Again, he's not arbitrary. He doesn't appeal to something other than himself. And therefore, there's a third option, and that is that goodness itself would not exist without God. It comes from God. It is part of his character. So anything that God decrees is by necessity good, and he cannot decree that which is not good. And that's where the Euthyphro dilemma fails. It's the fallacy of either or. It says either God arbitrarily chooses what is good or moral, or he appeals to something other than himself and discovers what is good. But again, there's the third option that I already gave you. And that's why it commits the bifurcation fallacy. So if you found this episode helpful or learned something new, let me know in the comments. And also let me know if you have come across this sort of thing. Like, have you come across this exact dilemma? Has anybody ever brought this up to you? Have there ever been any examples of arguments that somebody has posed to you where you were able to point out the faulty reasoning? Like, have you had anybody give you like an either or fallacy? Leave it in the comments and let me know. Because hey, maybe there's something there that I haven't seen. But like, again, have you made this point? Or has anybody made this point in any discussion you've ever had? And ultimately, how did you respond? Leave that too, because again, I'm always learning, and you guys might, probably teach me something. So if maybe you responded in a way that I haven't thought of, and maybe it's really impactful and helpful. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts and learn myself, as I'm always doing. So if you like this content and these kinds of topics, then make sure you subscribe so you don't miss anything in the future. Keep thinking critically, stay grounded in truth, and seek wisdom above all else. And brothers and sisters, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Remember to always go and give a reason for the hope that is in you for all who ask, but make sure that you do it with gentleness and reverence. So thanks for watching. I will see you next time.